When the fake cops showed up to tow my government-issued SUV in the middle of the night, I honestly thought it was a prank, some late-night neighborhood hazing for the new guy, but by the time I realized what they really wanted, it was already too late to pretend this was just about a parking ticket. I'd spent 22 years in federal service, mostly in the kind of places you don in oppos. Talk about at dinner parties, deep cover ops and biker gangs, tracking militia movements in the backwoods, and dealing with people who had no respect for a badge or a life. So when I finally decided to hang it up and take a, quiet, consulting gig, I chose Oak Creek Estates because I wanted normal. I wanted to be the guy who complained about the mail being late or the grass being a half-inch too long, but normal only lasted about 3 weeks. It all started on one of those gray, humid mornings where the air feels like a damp blanket just before dawn, when your body still has that old tactical reflex where you wake up before the alarm because something in the house's rhythm feels off. And that's when I heard it, the heavy, metallic clank of a tow lift and the low, throaty rumble of a diesel engine idling right outside my bedroom window. I pulled back the blinds, squinting against the harsh glare of red and blue flashers, and for a second, my heart did that steady, slow thumping it used to do in the field because standing there by my driveway were 2 guys in tactical vests with the words HOA enforcement stenciled across the back in aggressive, white block letters. I didn't in oppos. Rush out. I just watched them for a minute, noting the way they moved, too stiff, too eager, like kids playing dress-up in their dad's gear. And I noticed their badges didn't in oppos. Have that dull, heavy weight of real metal. They had this cheap, plastic sheen that caught the streetlights in all the wrong ways. I stepped out onto the porch in my t-shirt and boxers, leaning against the doorframe, and I just said, "Morning, fellas, a bit early for a car wash," I said in oppos. It, and the tall one, a guy with a buzz cut and a neck thicker than his head, didn't in oppos. Even look up from his clipboard as he barked, "Sir, this vehicle is in violation of Community Ordinance 22. It's being impounded for failure to display a resident decal," And I just leaned there, half amused, and told him that. The vehicle was federal property, and that if he touched that hitch, he'd be interfering with a government asset. That's when she appeared, stepping out from the shadows of the maple tree across the street like she'd been waiting for her cue, Mrs. Evelyn Thorne. The HOA president and a woman whose personality was basically a mix of a high school principal and a prison warden. And she was wrapped in a silk robe that probably cost more than my first car, smiling that thin, icy smile that doesn't in oppos. Reached the eyes, and she said, "Now, Agent Miller, let's not make a scene. We're just trying to keep the aesthetic of Oak Creek consistent, and that rugged truck of yours just doesn't in oppos. Fit the vision." I looked at her, then back at the officers who were now actually hooking up the chains, and I realized this wasn't oppos. About a parking decal. It was about dominance. It was Evelyn showing the new guy that in this cul-de-sac, she held the high ground. So I just reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and told her that if they didn't in oppos, unhook that car in 5 seconds. I'd have the local sheriff down here for impersonating law enforcement. But she just laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and said, "Oh, Jack, the sheriff is a dear friend. He's the one who helped us set up our private security liaison program. So please go ahead and call." That was the first red flag, the first sign that the rot in this neighborhood went a lot deeper than just a bossy neighbor. And as I watched them tow my SUV down the street, I didn't in oppos. Get angry, I just got quiet. Because when you spend 2 decades hunting predators, you learn that the best way to catch one is to let them think they've already won. The next day, the war of attrition really began, and it wasn't in oppos. Just about the car anymore, which I had to spend 6 hours and $500 to get out of a private lot owned by Evelyn's nephew. Shocker, right? But suddenly I was getting fined for everything. I got a notice for unauthorized floral arrangements because I put a pot of red geraniums on my porch. I got hit with a $300 penalty for excessive noise because I was watching a football game on a Saturday afternoon with the window cracked, and then came the video. Someone, and we all know who, posted a heavily edited clip on the neighborhood and oppos as private Facebook group showing me threatening the HOA officers, but they'd stripped the audio and slowed it down so it looked like I was lunging at them, and the caption read, Is this the kind of an oppos, federal agent in oppos, we want living near our children? End quote. It was a masterclass in character assassination, and within 48 hours, I was getting side eyes from the guy who used to wave when he got his mail, and the lady next door, Sarah, who seemed nice enough, actually pulled her kids inside when she saw me walking down the driveway. But Evelyn made one massive mistake. She thought I was just an aging Fed looking for a quiet place to rot. She didn't, and oppos. T realized that my last 5 years in the Bureau were spent in the Financial Crimes and Public Corruption Unit. So while she was busy sending me fines for my lawn height, I was sitting in my dark living room with a glass of bourbon and a high-speed fiber connection, digging into the public records of Oak Creek Estates. And that's when the house of cards started to wobble, because it turns out the, end quote, private security liaison, end quote, program she was so proud of was being funded through a, end quote, special assessment fee, end quote, that had an oppos, T been voted on by the board in 3 years, and the company providing the guards, Apex Protection, was registered to a holding company in Delaware that shared a mailing address with Evelyn's own real estate firm. I started seeing the patterns. The way residents who complained about the fees suddenly found themselves buried in violations until they sold their homes at a loss, only for those homes to be snatched up by that same Delaware holding company. And I realized I wasn't oppos. T just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. I was looking a localized racketeering ring that used suburban, end quote, order, end quote, as a weapon to strip people of their equity. I called up an old buddy of mine, Marcus, a guy who's still in the thick of it at the state level, and I told him I needed a favor, a deep dive into some routing numbers. And while I waited for him to get back to me, I decided to have a little, end quote, neighborly, end quote, chat with Evelyn at the community clubhouse. I walked in while she was decorating for the, end quote, summer gala, end quote, looking like she was the Queen of England organizing a royal ball, and I just laid a copy of my geranium fine on the table and said, end quote, Evelyn, we need to talk about the Delaware filing for APX Holdings, end quote. And you should have seen her face. Just for a split second, that mask of hers slipped and I saw the shark underneath. But she recovered fast, smoothing her hair and saying, end quote, I don an oppos. To know what you and oppos, re. Talking about, Jack, but if you and oppos, re here to harass me, I'll have the guards escort you out, end quote. And I just leaned in close, low enough that only she could hear me, and said, end quote, the thing about shadows, Evelyn, is that they disappear when you turn on a big enough light, and I'm about to flip the switch, end quote. She didn't, end oppos. T take it well, of course, and the next night, my power went out, just my house, none of the neighbors, and when I went out to the breaker box, I found the lock had been cut, and the wires had been sprayed with something that smelled like industrial-strength corrosive. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that I don and oppos. T just rely on the grid. I had my own independent battery-backed internal cams, and I caught the whole thing on 4K night vision. One of the, end quote, HOA officers, end quote, doing the deed while Evelyn stood by the sidewalk, checking her watch. And that was the, end quote, smoking gun, end quote, I needed. But it got even crazier because Marcus called me back that morning, sounding breathless, and he told me that the money trail didn't, and oppos. T stop at Evelyn. It went all the way to the county commissioner's office, a guy named Henderson who'd been rubber stamping these private security grants for years, taking a kickback on every, end quote, violation, end quote, collected. This was a whole ecosystem of corruption, a little kingdom built on the fear of homeowners who just wanted to be left alone. And I realized that if I went to the local cops, the report would probably, end quote, disappear, end quote, before it hit the sergeant's desk. So I had to go bigger. I had to make a spectacle. The annual HOA board meeting was scheduled for that Friday. The big, end quote, state of the neighborhood, end quote, address where Evelyn usually spent 2 hours talking about mulch and the, end quote, integrity of our borders, end quote. And I spent the days leading up to it hand-delivering invitations to a few people she'd stepped on. The widower who'd been fined into a heart attack, the young couple who lost their deposit over a, end quote, non-conforming, end quote, mailbox, and I told them to just show up, no questions asked. When the night came, the clubhouse was packed, the air thick with that weird suburban tension, and Evelyn was up there on the stage with a gavel, looking like she was presiding over the UN, and she started in on her speech about, end quote, community standards, end quote, and, end quote, the unfortunate presence of disruptive elements, end quote, clearly nodding toward me in the back row. I'll let her finish. I'll let her soak in the polite, fearful applause, and then I stood up and said, and quote, Evelyn, before we move to the vote on the new assessment, I think everyone here would love to see a little film I made, and quote. And before she could protest, I plugged my laptop into the projector system I'd, and quote, borrowed, and quote, from the audio-visual closet. The room went dead silent as the 4K footage of the vandalism played. Evelyn's face was crystal clear in the night vision. Her bored expression as her, and quote, officer, and quote, destroyed my property, and then I started scrolling through the Delaware filings, the bank transfers, and the emails between her and Commissioner Henderson, showing exactly where every dollar of those, and quote, parking fines, and quote, was actually going. The sound that came out of the room wasn't an oppose, a roar. It was a collective gasp, the sound of 100 people realizing they'd been paying for their own oppression, and Evelyn started screaming, and quote, this is doctored. He's a federal agitator. Guards, remove him, end quote. But the, end quote, guards, end quote, didn't, and oppose. Move because they were too busy looking at the two very real, very stern state police officers I'd had Marcus send over to wait in the wings. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The pride, the arrogance, the silk robe-wearing authority, all of it just evaporated as she was let out in handcuffs, still screeching about, and quote, community bylaws, and quote, while the neighbors she'd bullied for years stood up and started shouting her down. But here's the thing, and this is what keeps me up at night, even now that the clubhouse is under new management and the, end quote, HOA police, end quote, are in a county jail cell. When I was packing on my laptop, I saw a folder on Evelyn's computer that I had in oppose, seen before, labeled, in quote, Phase 2, end quote. And when I opened it, I realized Oak Creek was just one of 12 neighborhoods in this district with the same setup, the same shell companies, the same, end quote, security, end quote, contracts. We cut off the head of one snake, sure, and Henderson ended up resigning, end quote, to spend more time with family, end quote, before the indictment could hit. But the system is still there. The laws that allow these mini dictatorships to thrive are still on the books, and I can't, and oppose. Help, but wonder how many other people are sitting in their living rooms right now, terrified to paint their front door a different color because they don and oppose. Know that their HOA president is actually a racketeer. I moved to the suburbs to get away from the, end quote, bad guys, end quote, but I learned the hard way that the most dangerous criminals aren't, and oppose. The ones in the leather jackets or the back alleys, they, and oppose. The ones who use, end quote, property values, end quote, and, end quote, neighborhood standards, end quote, as a smoke screen for their own greed. I'm still living the house I didn't, and oppose. Let them run me out, and the lawn is exactly the height I want it to be, but every time I see a white SUV with, end quote, security, end quote, on the side, I feel that old itch in my palms because I know that for every Evelyn Thorne we catch, there are 10 more out there waiting for a, end quote, new guy, end quote, to move in so they can start the game all over again. So, I want to hear from you guys. Have you ever felt like your HOA was a little too, end quote, invested, end quote, in your private life? Is it just about the grass? Or have you seen something that didn't, and oppose? Feel right, something that felt less like a community and more like a shakedown? I'm starting to think that the real, end quote, public service, end quote, ISN, and oppose. What I did for 20 years in the Bureau. It's what we do for each other when we refuse to let people like Evelyn hold a gavel. So drop a comment, tell me your horror stories, and let's talk about who really owns these neighborhoods we live in. Is it us, or is it the people who send us the fines? Because if you don and oppose, stand up for your geraniums, eventually they and oppose, coming for the whole house.